A teenage girl's diary entry that will send a cold shiver up your spine. So what happened to poor 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten? And could a young 15-year-old girl be to blame? It was just another Wednesday night at home for Patty Price and her 3 kids, Anthony, Stephanie, and the youngest, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. Patty recounted that Elizabeth was going to be in a play at school, so she was practicing her lines and doing her little songs and irritating her brother, and I was getting ready to cook dinner. Then there was this knock at the door. When Patty answered it, it turned out to be a 6-year-old girl who lives across the woods. Patty says that the little girl asked if Elizabeth could go play, and originally I told her no because I was getting ready to make dinner, and both girls were hopping up and down, begging, wanting to go play, and I was like, okay, you can go for an hour. Then, as Elizabeth was leaving, she told her daughter and the other little girl that she had to be home by 6. It's October 21st, 2009, and the sun sets at 6:30 p.m. Patty wanted her daughter home before dark and to be on time for dinner. She also knows that Elizabeth is deathly afraid of the dark and that the deep, dense woods that separate their homes turn into a scary place once the sun goes down. But as the time ticked down and 6 o'clock came and left, Elizabeth was not home. Being that Elizabeth was afraid of the dark, this was very much not like her. So Patty immediately called her neighbors home, but they tell Patty that Elizabeth was not there. A chilling thing to hear. Patty says she just knew it wasn't right. Patty remembers they left together and the grandmother was telling me she was never there. That's when I called the police. And the Cole County Sheriff's Department responded immediately. They were on the scene in just 15 minutes. The first thing they did is the sheriff's deputies and Patty headed to the last known place Elizabeth was going, her neighbor's house, a pretty obvious place to start the investigation. Patty recounts that everybody said she wasn't there, so then they started doing a search. Patty continues that the fire department, local officers, and by 10 o'clock, there were hundreds of people looking for her. It turned into a large search rather quickly. There were tons of concerned residents and local law enforcement agencies that helped to form a grid search. They focused their search around Patty's and her neighbors' houses. But as time ticked on and Wednesday night became Thursday morning, there was still no sign of Elizabeth. Patty, Elizabeth's mom, said, "They kept telling me there's no signs of foul play. It's like she didn't just vanish, she's 9 years old." But then Patty shared with police that Elizabeth had her cell phone when she disappeared and that she had been calling it repeatedly since her daughter left. But all of her calls kept going to voicemail. With that little piece of information, investigators contacted the cell phone company. The investigators ordered what is called an emergency ping, which basically can track signals generated from the phone to the nearest cell tower. This data is collected and then used to zero in on the exact location of a cell phone. So in the case, could help detectives find Elizabeth. So when the sheriff's deputies started receiving pings from Elizabeth's cell phone, they found that the pings from the phone all were located in the general area of the woods, said Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Rice. He then went on that it was a large wooded area behind the house, but it's thick forest ground and it was a lot of area to cover. So the investigators needed to call for backup. Sergeant David Rice said it was the following day in which my investigative unit, became involved and was contacted to assist in the search. And that's when Sergeant David Rice said, "I believed she was still in the area." But if she was still in the area, why wasn't she answering her phone? Where was she hiding? Or even worse, did someone take her and was hiding her? So with this information, the investigators send out a missing persons report to the neighboring law enforcement agencies and the FBI. Sergeant David Rice said that we did a search of the woods of the area. We had checkpoints set up all around the area for everyone driving in and out of the area. A pretty big operation was set up to cover all areas of the search. Sergeant David Rice continued, adding, "We tracked down all the local registered sex offenders. We had planes in the air, helicopters, dog teams, dive teams for the ponds and rivers. Everything that we could do at the time, we were trying to locate her." It's clear that the investigators were getting more and more nervous as more and more time went by, and by Thursday afternoon, almost 24 hours since anyone has seen 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten, Sergeant Rice was desperate for answers. So he decided to turn his attention back to the last person to see Elizabeth, and that person would be the 6-year-old little girl, a neighbor who knocked on the door to see if Elizabeth could come over to her house. This little girl's name was Emma, and she was the one that lived just a couple houses down from Elizabeth, or across the woods. But all Emma remembered during her interview with the FBI was that she was playing with Elizabeth. Then Elizabeth started walking home, and that was the last time she saw her. Sergeant David Rice recounts that Emma, was outside playing with Elizabeth, and shortly after that became stuck in some thorn bushes and was crying and screaming for help, was crying for his sister, saying, "Alyssa, come help me." And that's when investigators turned their attention to another member of Emma's family, her sister, Alyssa Bustamante. Alyssa Bustamante, Emma's 15-year-old half-sister, wasn't a normal teenage girl, but we'll learn more about that later. At the time, the rest of the siblings, including Emma's 11-year-old twin half-brothers, were all with their grandmother and legal guardian, Karen. But this was not a strange occurrence for Elizabeth to be playing at the Bustamante home. The kids often played with each other, but why was this time different? Why hadn't Elizabeth come home after her playdate at the neighbor's house? And that's what investigators began to look at. Where was everyone during the time of Elizabeth's disappearance? And what they found was that during the time Elizabeth went missing, all the neighbor kids are accounted for except for Alyssa Bustamante. When asked about this, Sergeant David Rice said Alyssa admitted that she skipped school that day, which leaves Alyssa without an alibi during the mysterious disappearance. When asked more about Elizabeth's disappearance, Alyssa told Sergeant David Rice she was aware law enforcement couldn't find this girl, but stated she knew nothing about it whatsoever. While questioning Alyssa initially, the cops found Alyssa's behavior seemingly calm and forthcoming. They later recounted that it was thought that Alyssa should not be considered a suspect. But then who else could be to blame for Elizabeth's disappearance? What happened to the 9-year-old who left on a playdate and never came home? As searchers canvassed the woods behind the Bustamante home, local volunteers stumble across something very haunting in the backwoods. Sergeant David Rice recounted appeared to them to look like a grave in the woods, and that's when my investigative unit became primarily involved in it. But why would there be a grave out in the woods? Who would dig a random grave? That makes no sense. And is that where Elizabeth could be? And that's when Sergeant David Rice recalled, "We were called and asked to process the scene for the possibility that Elizabeth was in that hole, was in that grave." Sergeant Rice and his forensics team then went on to process the potential crime scene, a haunting mission to be sure. Sergeant David Rice said we had been out there for several hours, and then he recalled it was during this time that the FBI had been talking with Alyssa initially, so that's when the FBI brought Alyssa to the grave. Sergeant David Rice recounts, "I remember watching 2 FBI agents I know walk a young girl over to the scene, and it's then that Sergeant David Rice heard something that he considered very odd. He hauntingly remembers, 'I heard Alyssa say she dug the hole,' and of course my response to that was, 'Why did you dig the hole?' And Alyssa said, 'I just like digging holes,' and would bury dead animals when she found them. An incredibly chilling and bizarre hobby for a teenage girl. But there was no one in the shallow grave, so maybe Alyssa was telling the truth. Maybe. But time was passing, and Elizabeth's missing person case was now nearing the 48-hour mark and putting everyone more and more on edge. But Sergeant David Rice kept coming back to the strange empty hole that they found. Why would someone dig a random hole? And why was it the perfect size for a child? A child just about Elizabeth's size. At the same time, back at Alyssa Bustamante's home, the FBI were granted consent to search the home, and that included one of their evidence officers searching Alyssa's room. And that's when things took a fast turn. When the agent opened the teenage girl's bedroom door, it was a spine-chilling sight. It's recounted by the later prosecutor that the evidence officer found several things in that room to be disturbing. He said that the walls are covered with bizarre writings, some in pen, while others, it appears, are in blood. In one corner of the room, there's a poem about cutting. For those of you that don't know, cutting is a form of self-injury, usually involving a knife or razor blade, a behavior that others had witnessed Alyssa partake in. Alyssa's best friend, Jennifer, knew about her high school friend's sadistic secret. She told investigators, "I actually consulted one of our friends and he talked to her about it." Jennifer continued that, "We noticed a lot of scars on her wrists. She talked about suicide a lot. I know that she had attempted it a couple times." On another one of Alyssa's walls, there was a crude sketch of a person. The head and arm appeared to have slice and slash style markings. And upon a closer look, there was a name under the haunting depiction of the picture. The name read Emma, Alyssa's younger sister, which is completely creepy to say the least. Had Alyssa done something to Elizabeth? Maybe the shallow grave was for Emma, but Elizabeth became the unlikely target. What was really going on inside Alyssa's head? The investigators also found a lot of cards and letters taped to Alyssa's bedroom wall from a Caesar Bustamante. The return address, prison. Alyssa's former friend, Jennifer, said her father was in prison. He had gotten into some kind of physical altercation and her mother was on a lot. She was in and out of her life. So clearly, Alyssa was a very troubled teenager. But does that mean she's capable of committing murder? What could drive a 15-year-old girl to kill a 9-year-old? Unfortunately, some of the answers are even more grim than you could imagine. During the search of Alyssa's room, the FBI spots something else in Alyssa's bedroom, a diary, an ordinary possession for a young girl to have. But what investigators found when they opened it would change the course of this case forever and could make anyone sick to their stomach. When the investigators started to read Alyssa's diary, the words jumped off the page in the most haunting and disturbing way. Alyssa had written about a plethora of disturbing things, including burning down a house and killing people inside of it. And if that wasn't enough to turn some of the suspicion towards Alyssa, her last journal entry certainly did. The investigator noticed the last journal entry Alyssa made on Wednesday, October 21st, had been scribbled over. Like Alyssa didn't want anyone to read it. And that journal entry was from the very same day Elizabeth disappeared. So the agent collected the diary as potential evidence, and what they would find in that journal is truly haunting and would absolutely point all the suspicion towards Alyssa. So the next morning, which was 2 days since Elizabeth went missing, Alyssa was brought to the FBI headquarters for an interview with Sergeant David Rice for further questioning. He recounts that in combination with her strange behavior, I was confident that we were going into an interrogation at some point. But what happened next, Sergeant David Rice did not expect. Right before he's about to go in to question Alyssa, he's handed her diary. He remembers that the last entry of the diary, which was the day that Elizabeth went missing, was completely scratched out. But when investigators used a backlighting tool on the journal, they could make out 2 horrible words: slit and throat. So as Alyssa Bustamante, her grandmother, Sergeant Rice, and a juvenile officer file into the interrogation room, there is a loaded silence. Sergeant David Rice says silence is very effective during an interview or interrogation because people feel very uncomfortable in silence. So now Sergeant David Rice is looking at Alyssa like a clear suspect. He remembers from the interrogation that there were pauses, I believe, that were up to 45 seconds to a minute long, and you could see the stress affecting Alyssa. You could see her eyes begin to tremor and her head begin to shake. Sergeant David Rice uses the stress of the situation to pressure Alyssa to break and tell the truth. So at a moment of high tension, he gives Alyssa her diary that they found in her room. Sergeant David Rice then tells her, "We have your diary, and we've read your diary, even the last entry which was scribbled out." Wow, that's a chilling sentiment. Sergeant David Rice said, "Then I just waited." But Sergeant David Rice didn't have to wait very long. He recounts that the effect was almost immediate. He said, "Once I brought up the diary, I could see a distinct shift in her demeanor, and I think it was at that point she knew that we knew." So Alyssa begins to crack and recount what actually happened to Elizabeth on the night of her disappearance. She tells Sergeant David Rice that what happened was an accident, that she had been walking in the woods with Elizabeth when she fell and hit her head. Alyssa says that Elizabeth suddenly died. Knowing what Sergeant David Rice knows about the homicide, he then explained to Alyssa that they were going to find Elizabeth's body, and then they were going to do an autopsy. And when they did an autopsy, they were going to find every injury that Elizabeth had when she died. It was at that point that Sergeant David Rice took Alyssa's diary into account and asked Alyssa the most pointed and haunting question. Was her throat cut? It was at that point that Alyssa said yes. That's when Alyssa's grandmother broke down and began crying, but no tears could save Alyssa from the confession she just made. It was clearly a huge break in the case and completely implicated and all but confirmed that Alyssa did have something to do with Elizabeth's disappearance and possible murder. It was at that point that Alyssa's grandmother left the interrogation room, and then Alyssa confessed to everything. Sergeant David Rice said that Alyssa said she sent Emma, her sister, over to the Olten house to pick Elizabeth up. From that point, she claimed that she told Emma to go back home and that she took Elizabeth by the hand and walked her into the woods. Sergeant Rice recalls it's a quarter of a mile or a 15-minute walk into the woods to where Elizabeth's body would later be discovered, which would leave plenty of time for Alyssa to think about what she was about to do and stop. But Alyssa didn't stop. She continued leading the helpless 9-year-old girl into the woods, saying, "I've got something really neat to show you. It's just a little bit further up here." A haunting nightmare for any parent to hear, because unbeknownst to Elizabeth, Alyssa was armed with a kitchen knife and is leading her toward a pre-dug grave, another pre-dug grave. So Sergeant David Rice's instincts about the grave were exactly correct. Alyssa had been planning this. Sergeant David Rice said that Alyssa said once she arrived at the site of the hole that she began to strangle Elizabeth while she was facing her, that she strangled her multiple times and stabbed her in the chest, I believe 6 or 7 times, and then cut her throat. Absolutely gruesome and horrific account. After her confession, Alyssa finally agreed to take Sergeant David Rice to Elizabeth's body. Sergeant David Rice recalls that she knew exactly where it was, led us directly to it. When investigators arrived at the gravesite, Sergeant David Rice remembers it was not well covered. Once she pointed out the area and you looked a little bit closer, you could see that she was only a few inches, if that, under the ground, and you could see body parts that came up covered with mud. It's a pretty horrifying homicide. After Elizabeth's body was recovered, the results of the autopsy appeared to mirror Elizabeth's diabolical diary, which at this point, investigators were able to recover fully, and their findings would chill anyone to the bone. Alyssa's diary reads, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now, LOL." Sergeant David Rice reflects, and later the prosecution would say this was very premeditated by the 15-year-old murderer because she had dug the grave holes at least 5 days in advance of the murder. And it was premeditated in the sense that she sent her sister down to get Elizabeth out of the house for the purpose of murdering her. A truly gruesome and horrific crime for such a young person to commit. So what would cause a young teenager to commit such a diabolical crime? Sadly, maybe the signs of a troubled teen were there all along. But for many, Alyssa Bustamante seemed like an ordinary teenage girl. Friends of Alyssa said that she was just always so sweet and everybody loved her. She was just amazing. But a very different picture of who Alyssa was existed inside her mind. And as her internet persona revealed, there was a much darker person lurking beneath the surface of this 15-year-old girl. It may have surprised her friends and family, but Alyssa Bustamante's virtual alter ego would foreshadow her most heinous act, the murder of Elizabeth. Between 2002 and 2009, Alyssa Bustamante was raised by her grandparents. Her mother, Michelle Bustamante, had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, which led to criminal charges and jail time. And her father, Cesar Bustamante, was serving jail time for assault, which would be very hard on any child. But it still doesn't explain how Alyssa went from a troubled teen to a cold-blooded killer. While Alyssa was growing up, her grandparents took legal custody of her and her 3 younger siblings in California. Clearly, both her parents had their own issues and could not take care of them. To escape their former lives, the kids moved to a rural ranch-like property in St. Martins, Missouri, just west of the state capital of Jefferson City. And despite all the horrible setbacks of her parents, Alyssa became an A and B student in high school, which again doesn't explain what made her snap. Many recount that Alyssa Bustamante was a normal kid by all appearances, and her grandparents provided a stable home for her. Even friends said that Alyssa would write poems and joke around, and that she regularly attended church at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where she participated in several youth activities. So none of this paints the picture of someone who would later commit one of the most horrific murders. But in 2007, the seemingly placid impression Alyssa gave to the world was shattered when she tried to kill herself. Clearly, things were not as they seemed on the surface. After spending 10 days at a psychiatric hospital in St. Martins, the teen went on antidepressants. But those medications did not stop all of Alyssa's destructive behaviors. Like investigators discovered, despite her medication, Alyssa practiced cutting herself several times. And close friends said she frequently showed them the scars on her wrists. So clearly, Alyssa was struggling with her own demons. Even though friends remember that Alyssa would always say she was taking pills for her depression, she would often say, "Oh, I need to take my medicine." But online, Alyssa was an entirely different person. Alyssa's MySpace and Facebook profiles are locked, but from the few glimpses of the profiles under cutesy handles, Alyssa Hearts You and ramen_noodles_woot on MySpace, and her girly full name, Alyssa Daleen Bustamante, on Facebook, a few snapshots of her life could be seen. And like most teens, Alyssa posed for profile pictures that aimed to communicate something about herself. But Alyssa's Twitter feed talked about how she hated authority. One post read, "Bad decisions make great stories." But that post could be made by any rebellious teenager. So what was so different about Alyssa? Well, for one thing, she listed her hobbies on YouTube and MySpace as killing people and cutting. And that's a horrifying statement, even to joke about. Alyssa also posted a YouTube video where she tried to get 2 of her brothers to try and touch an electrified fence. So clearly Alyssa's interest in hurting people might have started with her siblings. Alyssa clearly appeared to like hurting herself and others, and had the ability to take things to another level of horrifying. In one video on her page, Alyssa threatens to shoot one of her classmates on a school bus. And just a week before she killed Elizabeth, Alyssa had a journal entry where she said, "If I don't talk about it, I bottle it up. And when I explode, someone's gonna die." But perhaps the biggest warning sign of all happened at Alyssa's own 15th birthday party, when she was hanging out with her former best friend, Jennifer. Jennifer recalls hearing Alyssa say, "I just wonder what it would be like to just kill someone, see the life just drain out of someone. I wonder what it would feel like, that type of power, to take that away from someone." A truly horrible thing for anyone to say at any age, but also brings light to a very chilling truth about this case, which is, did Alyssa murder Elizabeth just for the thrill of it? The prosecution in Alyssa's case would later say that is one of the most reprehensible motives for murder that exists in humankind, and that is to murder a person for the thrill of murdering them. Kurt Valentine, Alyssa's attorney, had previously urged officials to be cautious with their judgments of the suspect, who he referred to as a child. He said, "I would ask that they wait, that they listen to the facts as they come out and not judge quickly." He went on by saying, "Learn about this person, learn about this child. You're dealing with a child." Alyssa did not have a prior criminal record. So the defense filed a motion to suppress Alyssa's previous confession during her interrogation. Wait, what? How? Well, Alyssa's defense team claimed that because she was juvenile, some of the questions asked during her interrogation weren't allowed under Missouri law. Unfortunately for the prosecution, the judge agreed, and thus Alyssa's confession to murder was thrown out of the case before the trial. I can't believe that can actually happen, but under the law, it does. Sergeant David Rice recalled, having the confession suppressed was a huge blow. This was a clear first-degree murder case. But that wasn't the only setback that the prosecution would face. There was another big blow to the prosecution's case on the horizon. The U.S. Supreme Court is likely to rule that life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles is unconstitutional. With that news coming in, the prosecutors offer up a plea deal to Alyssa, an amendment to murder in the second degree with a range of 10 to 30 years or life imprisonment with the chance of parole. So the prosecution said that they notified the mother and the family that that's what I had determined to do. But Elizabeth's mother, Patty, was not happy. She said, I was mad. I was very mad. But unfortunately, they did go forward with offering Alyssa the plea deal. Then a few weeks before her 2012 trial for first-degree murder was scheduled to begin, a little more than 2 years after the murder, Alyssa accepted a plea deal to the lesser charge of second-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. As part of the plea deal, she may get out of jail in 30 years on parole. During the sentencing phase, Alyssa addressed Elizabeth's family and states, I cannot even understand what you guys are going through. I'm sorry for that. If I could give my life to bring her back, I would, and I'm sorry. But Elizabeth's family did not accept her apology. Elizabeth's sister said, I don't think she can be sorry. I don't believe anything that she says. And Elizabeth's mother, Patty, said she was being fed what to say to us from her attorney, so none of it was real. But after getting a new attorney in 2014, Alyssa contended that she would not have pleaded guilty in 2012 had she known of a pending U.S. Supreme Court case that affected how the justice system should handle cases of juveniles and first-degree murder cases. The judge in the case denied the lawyer's plea for a new sentence. Her appeal against the sentence was denied in March 2014. But is that really enough justice for the premeditated murder of a 9-year-old girl? Well, even Alyssa's one-time best friend wonders that. I don't think there's anywhere that she should be besides prison, ever, because you just can't get away with something like that. And those sentiments were echoed by Elizabeth's family. When asked what Elizabeth's sister would say to Alyssa, she said that I hate her, that she's ruined everyone in my family's life. Elizabeth's sister went on by adding that she changed everybody's life so drastically. It's not fair. She shouldn't be sitting in prison. She should die too. And Elizabeth's mother, Patty, added, I don't care how old she was. Age didn't have anything to do with it. There's no rehabilitation for her. Clearly, Elizabeth's family did not feel justice was served. But how could you when nothing will bring back their innocent 9-year-old girl? So following Alyssa's conviction, Elizabeth's mother, Patty, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Alyssa Bustamante's grandparents and siblings and against 2 employees from the Pathways Community Behavioral Health Care. Patty's lawsuit says that Pathways personnel knew that Alyssa had violent tendencies and threats, and therefore should have detained Alyssa. The lawsuit seeks fair and just expenses for Elizabeth's death, plus monetary damages for Patty's pain and suffering and punitive damages. Patty included Pathways Behavioral Health Care and 2 of its employees as defendants because she felt Alyssa murdered her daughter while under their care. She believed that the health system should have seen Alyssa's violent tendencies coming and taken preventative measures. Pathways employees stated that they were aware of the same violent propensities of Alyssa, as well as the specific identifiable threats to harm Olten, the lawsuit says. But none of these defendants took actions to detain Alyssa, and none warned Olten or Price of the specific threat on Olten, nor did they take any action that might have prevented Bustamante from harming Olten. During the initial hearing, a Pathways counselor, Ron Wilson, who was named as a defendant in the lawsuit, had testified during Alyssa's sentencing that she had not indicated she was a threat to anyone but herself. The lawsuit, which was filed October 18th, was assigned to Cole County Circuit Judge Patricia Joyce, who also presided over Alyssa's original sentencing hearing. Alyssa was seen by several mental health professionals who all testified that she had major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. But it didn't seem that anyone knew or suspected that Alyssa would do what she admitted in court. Beyond her initial confession, Alyssa also had admitted in court that she strangled Elizabeth, then said that she had stabbed her and slit her throat, then buried the child in a wooded area behind their homes. During the hearing, prosecutors pointed to a journal entry written by Alyssa on the night of the slaying, in which she described it as an amazing experience. This is why Patty, Elizabeth's mother, felt as if the original sentence was still too light. In court, she called Alyssa Bustamante a monster and said that she hated everything about her. During Alyssa's original sentencing, Patty's speech was so poignant and impassioned that the judge had to ask her to stop. But a judge threw out the lawsuit against Pathways, clearly not seeing that there was enough evidence to convict them. However, Alyssa will ultimately owe Patricia Price $5 million in damages, plus interest at 9% per year until the debt is paid. Elizabeth's family also sued Alyssa herself to ensure that the killer teen cannot profit from her crime. No books, no movies, nothing. But no matter the outcome of any of the trials, will justice ever really be served? The fact still remains that an innocent little girl lost her life due to the uncontrollable and violent whims of a troubled teenager. If you or someone you know has a mental illness, is struggling emotionally, or has concerns about their mental health, there are ways to get help. Use these resources to find help for you, a friend, or a family member. The National Institute of Mental Health, the lead federal agency for research on mental disorders, offers basic information on mental disorders, a range of related topics, and the latest mental health research. It is not the intention of NIMH to provide specific medical advice, but rather to provide users with information to better understand their health and their diagnosed disorders. Consult with a qualified healthcare provider for diagnosis, treatment, and answers to your personal questions. Call 911 if you or someone you know is in immediate danger, or go to the nearest emergency room. 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. Use Lifeline chat on the web. The Lifeline provides 24-hour confidential support to anyone in suicidal crisis or emotional distress. Call or text 988 to connect with a trained crisis counselor. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Brandi. I'll see you next time.